People with borderline personality disorder often face a higher degree of stigma than people with other mental illness. And since this is a show about reducing the stigma associated with mental illness, tonight, on our first episode of the season, my expert guest will shed some light on borderline personality disorder. That's next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. We begin our 7th season with a discussion about borderline personality disorder. People living with this mental health condition often feel misunderstood and are often maligned, sadly, even by other mental health professionals. Tonight, I have 2 guests who will share their knowledge so we can have a better, more compassionate understanding of borderline personality disorder. But first, if you're a regular viewer, you know we depend on your questions to help explore this issue. So call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me for our season premiere are 2 guests who have specialized in the treatment of people with borderline personality disorder. Joanne Fairfield is a psychotherapist at the Human Development Center, and Patty Olson has a private practice and is the clinical supervisor of Fresh Start, a residential program for women with borderline personality disorder. Thank you so much for joining me on our 7th season. I can't believe that we've been here for 7 years. That's just incredible to me. That means I'm 7 years older, but who's counting, right? So we always like to get people on the same page, and I think that the borderline personality is a term that not everybody is familiar with, and probably even if they've heard the term, don't necessarily have a good understanding of what that means. So I'm going to ask both of you, but I'm going to ask Joanne to comment first on just getting us on the same page of what is borderline personality disorder.
Well, borderline personality disorder is basically, like most diagnoses, a constellation of symptoms. But they're usually symptoms that are long-standing, that they've become a part of how that person operates in the world. And they can symptoms can include things like intense emotionality, not just their own emotions, but sensitivity to other people's. It can include chronic and intense suicidal thinking, which may sometimes lead to repeat suicide attempts, may not. Can also include self-injurious behaviors where people will harm themselves. It also is impulsivity, struggles with controlling anger, managing intense anger. It can be about intense feelings of fear of being abandoned, a really unstable sense of who you are. But no one symptom alone is going to give you that diagnosis. There have to be at least 5 from the ones that are written up in the DSM. But it's a tough diagnosis for a lot of people because it carries a stigma. There are agencies who, when they see that diagnosis, will say that they will not see the person, or they have a set notion about what they're going to have to deal with before they've even met the client.
I want to talk a little bit about the stigma later, but I want you first, Patty, to sort of just expound on what the person living with borderline personality disorder, what it's like to be in their skin with some of the symptoms that Joanne was describing.
Emotional life becomes excruciating. I mean, one way to kind of encapsulate those diagnostic criteria is that this is a disorder of severe emotion dysregulation. And the misunderstanding, I think, comes from the idea that, I mean, many of us, well-intentioned, can fall into the idea that or forget or not understand that people are doing the best that they can. And that when they're having a hard time regulating or processing emotions, they just don't have the skills or the capacity in that moment.
So I think related to that, what you mentioned is this notion of people doing the best that they can,
Yes.
and how sometimes the behavior comes across to other people as that's not the first thought that somebody has in relation to that, is that this person is doing the best that they can.
True, and I think that part of the deal with that is that people tend to, in the general run of things, think that we're in charge of our emotions. And they don't like to think of our emotions feeling like they're in charge of us. But if you have borderline personality disorder, your emotions are so intense, and that's biological. It's not something people choose. They are born with that temperament. We don't know exactly all the biological pieces of it, but we know that it's definitely a biological component. And so they're not choosing to be super sensitive. I mean, I had it once described to me really well, is that exquisite sensitivity to emotions is almost like have one layer less of skin. That you not only are sensitive to your own emotions, but you're sensitive to the emotions of others around you. And then that ability to be able to then interpret becomes difficult because our emotions are so revved. It's just an incredibly difficult place to be.
And so people exist then almost as if their emotional capacity is always turned on high and high alert. And we all have periods of time in our life where we are overstressed and where we're on high alert. But for many of us, that doesn't exist sort of chronically in our life. But when it does, the next little thing that comes down the road is the thing that tips us over. And I think what both of you are describing then is the notion that if that's the way your insides are biologically, you're wired that way chronically, then every little thing that comes down the road is a big thing then. Is that fair for me to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm smiling because I'm thinking of the metaphors I use with my clients in explaining this. And there's a smoke detector in my house that's inconveniently located near the kitchen. And it'll go off if I'm boiling water and I don't shut the door, you know? So it's, I've got this device that has a function and it works really well, but it works so well that the alarm will go off when there is no danger. And I think that's not unlike how the brain of someone with this disorder functions. Mm-hmm. Which then can get into a cycle. It just exacerbates itself because if your environment doesn't understand that, often the reaction is, you're too sensitive, just calm down. Why does everything have to be a big deal? Mm-hmm. Which creates more of a sense of invalidation and certainly doesn't help the person regulate themselves and calm down.
Talk about that whole notion of invalidation and what that is like for the person who's living with borderline personality disorder.
Well, I just want to pick up where you left off. So somebody is reacting intensely emotionally to something, and the other person, and this is if you like, the social bit of the thing that keeps things going, is that they don't quite know how to respond frequently. They don't understand what's going on. That person's also doing their best more often than not, but they're going, why is this such a big deal? What that's received as by the person with the diagnosis is that's received as like, nobody understands me, I can't cope, and it actually escalates the emotion intensity for them. They may appear sometimes to shut down on the outside, but inside everything's imploding. And they have the sense that there's something always wrong with them, that they are somehow or other broken, not working right, and we call that invalidation. And that invalidation is not always deliberate, but it comes out of people's either not understanding, not recognizing, or not knowing how to respond. I mean, we talk about our clients, you know, they know what they're experiencing, but they don't necessarily know why, and they certainly don't have the skills always to know how to deal with it. Well, I think that's true for folks in the environment as well. They don't know how. And so the one starts to feed the other. And that's why you'll see a lot of really intense relationships and broken relationships in the person who has borderline personality disorder.
You often hear other people refer to people with borderline personality disorder as manipulative. Which is about as invalidating as you can get, number one. But talk a little bit about, I guess I would like you to talk about both sides of that. Why the behavior may be perceived as manipulative, and then what that does to the person who's hearing, you're being manipulative.
Mm-hmm. I want to start with something that I heard that really helped me remember how absurd that really is, despite how it looks that way. There's a really nice documentary called Back from the Edge, and it's on YouTube if anyone is interested in learning more. And in that video, they feature not just experts on the disorder, but also 3 people who are recovering from this and living with borderline. And one of the people in the film commented on this idea of manipulation and said, to manipulate, you need to be able to be planning and choosing. But when someone is in that highly reactive emotional state, none of us, when we're that emotional, can make good decisions. We're not able to sequence and plan and think about outcomes. So when you think about it that way, that when someone is highly emotional and behaving in a way that might appear to be manipulative, it might bring our own logic into it and say, well, they're not in a state where they can be that planful and intentional about things.
I was doing some reading before I came here tonight, and a psychiatrist had written about the notion that what is being labeled as manipulative is in fact part of the illness. Mm-hmm. And so there is that judgmental sense with the word manipulative, that it is behavior that is completely within your control, that is not a part of an illness, that if you say it's part of an illness, that's just excuse making for the behavior, when in fact this is what we're saying is that this is part of the illness behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, one of the things that people will often see is folks with this diagnosis will often engage in self-harm, like I said at the beginning, or engage in suicidal threats or thinking. And sometimes because it happens again and again, that's actually the person's attempt to regulate themselves, to express in the only way that they've got left how in that moment about how they are completely lost. And it's not about, I'm trying to get attention in this manipulative sense of that, but yes, do they need attention? You bet. But what they need is validating attention. They need somebody to say, I get it. This is really hard right now. This is really, really hard. You can validate how somebody feels, but you don't have to go along with the behavior. The two are separate. Mm-hmm. One influences the other, but if you can validate the feelings, that behavior, I guarantee you, will start to dissipate.
So it is about understanding that the behavior can be sort of a communication about, this is how I am feeling right now. The only way I know how to express how I am feeling or to regulate how I am feeling is by engaging in this behavior, and then if that is dismissed, either by friends or by family members or by other mental health professionals, it sends the message that, oh, I didn't understand you. I didn't understand. What were you saying? And if the only language that you have is to maybe engage in self-injury, then it's like, oh, well, I'll tell you again then.
I'm not even, I want to be careful also about this idea of communicating and things being that intentional. In my work with people who have what we refer to as target behaviors, the real intense emotionality, self-injury, overdosing, suicide attempts. Maybe it's gambling or substance abuse or having sex with someone you barely know, or other things that when you're in your wise mind you wouldn't ordinarily do. Those behaviors really, they're very effective at regulating emotion in the short term, but they have some very serious consequences in the long term, and they're not a long-term solution to regulating. When when I meet with someone, that's one of the first things that we talk about is, well, how does this work for you? You know, particularly with self-injury. How, what is the function? Because that is validating, is to say, I know you want to change this, and I know you're doing it because in the short term it does work for you. And it's not very often that people are consciously aware or say, well, I'm doing this to communicate to other people the distress I'm feeling. I don't know if that's, you know, a matter of not having that insight, but for many people it's certainly not always the main intention. The intention is just to not feel so awful.
To shut it down.
To shut it down.
To shut it down, or at least to bring the intensity down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, that becomes then potentially a part of the cycle, because then, so you get the immediate relief from whatever it was that you did to get the relief, and then you get the backlash? No.
Backlash.
Thank you. The backlash of, one, other people's reaction to what you did, and two, your own sense of helplessness, because it may have given you some relief, but here I am again, and now I've done this, and now people are going to think that.
Or shame.
And shame and guilt kicks like crazy, and then the intensity starts again, and I still don't have another way of handling it.
And shame and self-loathing can often be a part of borderline personality disorder as well.
Yeah. Not knowing who you are or what is of value. I mean, the other symptom I forgot to mention is that a chronic feeling of emptiness inside. One person I worked with talked about feeling like it was just like a clanging bell in there. It was just empty.
That's a beautiful metaphor of describing that that experience in a way, especially for people who wouldn't know what that would mean, of what does it mean to feel empty inside. Here's a question from a viewer, Patty. Is borderline personality disorder the same as multiple personality disorder?
Heavens, no.
So explain this for the viewing audience, because that's kind of what I said at the beginning, is that the viewing audience doesn't necessarily understand what borderline person, and we, you know, they hear these terms sort of loosely in the media, and often in context in a movie where it's even more loose and inaccurate.
Yeah. Well, and I'm trying to kind of get my mind around where that misconception might be, and I suppose because this, I mean, if we were to just kind of back up and talk about what it means to be highly emotionally sensitive, there are three characteristics of that. One is a very sudden reaction to an emotional stimulus. The other is that it's a very intense reaction. And then the third is what we refer to as a slow return to baseline. So, you know, many of us might get an emotional, something that triggers us, and we might have a very strong feeling, but then we settle down right away. The person with this disorder has a hard time getting back to whatever their baseline is, which is already a higher sensitivity than the average person. And I suppose that might be where that misconception could come from, is if you suddenly are behaving in a very different way than you were 5 seconds ago, you know, that someone might be like, well, who is this? What's this all about? And you know, and then the behavior flips again. Or the identity issues that Joanne was talking about. If you can't regulate your emotion, you can't have solid relationships. And if you don't have relationships, it's hard to kind of bounce around and figure out who you are. And so I suppose that could contribute to that idea of different personalities.
Because I think when you don't know who you are, that you can almost come off like a chameleon.
Yes.
You're trying to people please.
Presenting different
So you'll
faces.
present different personas in an attempt to please, to cover and be able to smooth the way through when you're feeling really raw.
Or to fit in and connect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we all do that. I mean, I'm a different person if I'm visiting my in-laws. You know, I'm going to have certain different traits in that situation than if I'm going to the bank and asking for a loan. I can still remember as a small child the shock of seeing what my father looked like at work. He had a different voice, you know, he responded to things differently. He didn't have a multiple personality, even if I had that word, But I certainly was aware that he was presenting very differently in different settings. But with borderline personality disorder, that effort to fit in, to try and make the very disparate pieces work, can perhaps, maybe that's why people think, oh, they have multiple personalities.
As well as not that avoidance of that feeling of rejection and fear of abandonment that goes, is that I need to figure out what you want from me so that you don't leave me, or you don't reject me, or you don't think poorly of me.
Which in turn makes it really difficult to form the relationship. Because if I'm pretending to be everything that you want me to be, in the back of that is, because you wouldn't like me if you knew what I was really like. So even if you say you really like me, I can dismiss that because you don't know me. And that becomes a self-perpetuating piece. And it's for protection. It's nothing more than a really intense need to protect oneself.
Patty, a caller asked the question that they heard that borderline personality disorder can start with childhood abuse. Is that true?
It's certainly not a universal. As Joanne said, there's very clearly a biological component to this, and we don't know all the reasons why some people come into the world with this high emotional sensitivity. But certainly those adverse experiences, it can be childhood abuse, it can be, for some people, they describe bullying in school or at an early age as a really profound experience that leads to that sense of disconnection, of not fitting in. Abuse is one of the most awful ways of being invalidated, not, just not being recognized as.
So often, but not always, then is the answer. And I can't believe that we're getting a bit short of time already. I want to talk just a little bit about the notion of, is borderline personality disorder treatable?
Okay, so I'm old school, and I was raised, personality disorders de facto are not going to be treatable in the sense of cured. What they are is learning how to live with who you are and have a life that's truly worth living as you are. It's not that we're going to change your exquisite sensitivity to emotion, which is actually a strength as well as a weakness if you have the skills to live with it. Yes. But how can you live a really life that you can enjoy, that is satisfying and fulfilling? That we can do. That's what the therapy can be based on, giving people the skills to learn how to do that and move into relationship.
And what would you say is the message of hope that you would like to leave our viewing audience with, Patty?
That this is a very treatable condition. You mentioned your old school, and that was what we were taught, is this was not treatable. And research now shows that many people after treatment no longer meet criteria for BPD. I can't rattle off the statistics, but we do know that. And you may continue to be an emotionally sensitive person, but living with that, with the skills to be able to recognize and understand your own emotions, to be able to work effectively with them so that you can build those relationships that we all need to thrive and to have a life worth living.
I think that's a wonderful message of hope to leave the audience with. And so here's what we know. And what Patty just said was that borderline personality disorder is now a very treatable condition, thanks to Dr. Marsha Linehan, who really was the founder of one of the most effective treatments, which you are going to hear more about from the same two guests on October 20th. We're going to have them back, and we're going to hear about the treatment for borderline personality disorder. I think the other message of hope really needs to be directed towards us, and that call to be a gentler, kinder community where we see everyone, including ourselves, as doing the best that we can in the moment. And while we all may need a little work and a little improvement, we all in our hearts want to do the best that we can, and that includes the people who we may not have a great understanding of. I think if we find that as the compassion point, that would be the place for all of us to start. So thanks so much for joining the discussion on this, our very first show of our 7th season. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics, which reminds me, Carla, we need to do that tomorrow, and our resource links. Join us next week when we'll be talking about living with Asperger's. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.